So let us start with Chris Maynard. He's going to lead us into each day of this conference with the daily presentations on his unsystematic theology of information work. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, an unsystematic theology of data gathering. I guess I'd aspire to do a systematic one, but there's so much to talk about. And I'm writing a book about the theology of information work, and I'm considering using a similar title. I want to bring the Bible closer to information work, and I want to bring our information work closer to the Bible. My talks this week come from the work that I've been doing in that regard, and they'll feed back to make that book even better, I hope. When I was first appointed corporate data architect for a secular corporation, I tried to understand what information management was all about. I decided that there were many information chains within the corporation, some short, some very long, many of them interlacing, some of them broken. Most of them were computer-aided, but at every point along that chain, there were human beings who did three things. I called these activities gather, transform, and publish. So I find it interesting that the conference team, using your feedback from previous conferences, has settled on these three-day themes. Good questions guide data gathering. Good analysis produces knowledge. Good reporting leads to wiser decisions. Gathering, analysis, reporting. Whatever your role in information work, you'll find many analogies with what you do. Every information worker, every researcher, every journalist, every librarian, every mapper, every editor needs to pay attention to their own version of these three: gather, transform, and publish. How about this version? Read, select, write. Or maybe you could identify more with find, interpret, share. Let me put it in more oral terms. Listen, understand, speak. Or in qualitative terms, you might want to survey, analyze, and present. Jesus commands us to listen, to come and learn from him, and then bear witness to him. Throughout the Bible, there is the implication that human authors have gathered information, whether from God or from human beings, whether first or second hand, and then transformed it in some way, and then published it in written form that has come down to us. And if we don't understand Greek and Hebrew, then there has been further transformation through the good work of Bible translators. For instance, Luke writes this at the very start of his gospel. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Luke shows us explicitly his own process of gathering, transforming, and publishing. He investigated. He arranged an orderly account, and then he wrote it down so that you may know. He has an audience in mind and a specific purpose. From this, I take it that Luke had access to various sources, both first and second-hand. From some of this material that is unique to Luke, I personally conclude that at some point he had direct communication with Mary, Jesus' mother. And from certain details included at the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts, we can speculate that he was already directly involved and an eyewitness to the events of the birth of the church. This may be what he means when he says that he had carefully investigated everything from the beginning of the church, maybe. The way I read it, I guess that he already had a notebook full of careful investigations. When he was gathering, he probably thought it was just for his own benefit. I say he had a notebook, but of course, it was probably just carefully recorded in his memory. But I think he had been gathering information for some time before he decided to write that orderly account. Is there some information that you have been gathering, maybe just for your own edification, that might benefit from being arranged and published for the benefit of a current-day Theophilus? Luke investigated, ordered, and wrote. Or consider a couple of the stories that Jesus told of servants given money by their master. We could characterize that process as receive, increase, give back. Some of us who are commissioned to do some specific work for someone are in this situation. Here is some data. Tell me what it means. I think that all of us who take our information work seriously should pay attention to each of these three parts of the work. But let's turn our attention to this day in particular. God gathers data. 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 9 tells us, "For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him." In Psalm 11, verses 4 and 5, we read that the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. He observes everyone on earth. His eyes examine them. The Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked, those who love violence, he hates with a passion. And Ezekiel reports in chapter 20, verses 5 and 6, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. On the day I chose Israel, I swore with uplifted hand to the descendants of Jacob and revealed myself to them in Egypt. With uplifted hand, I said to them, I am the Lord your God. On that day, I swore to them that I would bring them out of Egypt into a land I had searched out for them, a land flowing with milk and honey, the most beautiful of all lands." God searches. From these passages, we read about a Lord that looks. His eyes range throughout the earth. He observes, he examines, he searches. He searched out a land for the Israelites. Jesus said of himself that he had come to seek and to save the lost. Seeking is a form of research. I would also point out that God asks questions. Now, I know that because God is all-knowing, we can say with one Bible teacher that I knew, when God asks a question, he's not seeking information. But by the same token, we can say that he doesn't need to look, observe, examine, or search, but the Bible says that he does these things. There are many mysteries and paradoxes at the heart of our wonderful relationship with God. From the 4th verse of Genesis chapter 1, God appears to be evaluating the light that he has created, examining it, considering it, to evaluate it. And as early as chapter 3, we have God's first research question. Where are you? He asks Adam. So simple a question, yet so profound. A question worth asking of ourselves from time to time, and even of our organizations. Where are we? Now, let's look a bit wider. At a previous conference, we looked at censuses in the Bible, the counting of people. I've now found about 9 censuses in the Bible that are called by the name census, plus various other lists and counts of people. I won't go into those in more detail here. Instead, I want to look at surveys of various kinds. Let's do a quick, unsystematic survey of surveys in the Bible. Some of them are initiated by humans, some are ordered by God. There were the 12 spies sent by Moses to survey the land of Canaan. Notice that in Deuteronomy, the plan to send in spies is presented as a proposal from the people approved by Moses, whereas in Numbers, God clearly tells Moses to send the spies. This suggests to me there are different ways to understand the relationship between our own initiative and God's initiative. In Numbers, we read that Moses gave them detailed instructions and several research questions to be answered. And as you know, the return of the spies was a fiasco. The majority report of the 10, while largely accurate on the facts, was not mixed with faith. I've heard at least one Bible teacher say that they should not have done the survey, but rather gone into the land blind. It doesn't seem, on the face of it, to be a good advertisement for spiritual research. But Joshua, who was involved in that research, and along with Caleb took the view of faith, was clearly not put off such research by his experience with the 10. When he later stood with the tribes of Israel on the east bank of the Jordan, he chose to send 2 spies into the land. Then, years later still, and the conquest incomplete, when there were 7 tribes without inheritance, Joshua organizes an even more systematic survey of the land that remains unconquered. The survey seems to me to be very relevant to much of our mission work today, because we're not in the situation of Moses or of the younger Joshua, where no land has yet been taken. We are in a situation where the job of discipling all nations is part complete and part incomplete. Joshua faced a situation where the job of settling the land was part complete and part incomplete. So I've been surprised that this episode is not generally referenced in the sources that I've managed to gather together consulting about a theology of information work. Maybe I missed it. I have found detailed analysis of Numbers chapter 13 and 14, the 12 spies, and some good thoughts about Joshua chapter 2, but virtually nothing about Joshua 18. So if you know of anything, let me know. You'll need to read the chapter yourself to find the many potential learning points. For me, one lesson is that a simple data gathering exercise, suitably framed and organized as it was by Joshua, could lead directly to the accomplishment of a purpose that Joshua had planned. Even though one of the tribes rejected the assignment that came out of their survey, this is Dan, and they chose to go somewhere else completely, yet they entered into their inheritance in a short period of time. Now, let's note a couple of other data gathering actions in the Bible. When I searched the whole Bible for the word measure, 45% of the hits were in the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel's vision of a new temple in Israel, there is someone whom he describes as a man whose appearance was like bronze, with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand. The man then proceeds to measure all sorts of details about the temple. He gathers data for Ezekiel to pass on to the people of Israel. And then finally, let me take you to the book of Acts. In chapter 17, Paul goes to Athens. In verse 16, we're told that he noticed the quantity of idols in the city. And then in verse 23, Paul says to the Athenians that he walked around the city and looked carefully at their objects of worship. That sounds to me very like an informal research trip. Data gathering does not always have to follow a formal pattern. But nevertheless, Paul says that he was careful in his observations. Indeed, he then transforms his observations by linking together his general point, you are very religious, with a specific observation of the inscription to an unknown God, with his knowledge of the Bible, and indeed with his knowledge of Greek poetry. He brings together 3 or 4 different sources, and then, of course, he publishes those results through his speech. He gathers, transforms, and publishes the information. God gathers information. At times, he has instructed his people or his angels to gather information, to count, to measure, or to record. And so we have many examples in the Bible which are able to rebuke us, to correct us, and train us in the righteous gathering of information. Thank you.